President Obama set to meet with Cuban President Raul Castro today, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to visit Cuba in nearly 90 years. This is part of Obama's administration to restore diplomatic ties with the country. My next guest is a former American aid worker who was imprisoned in Cuba for 5 years, yet he's calling for Congress to lift the U.S. trade embargo on Cuba. Former U.S. government subcontractor and ex-Cuba prisoner Alan Gross joins me right now. Alan, thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning, Maria. How are you?
What would you like to see come out of this trip?
Well, I think that exposure of the Cuban people to American leadership is an excellent opportunity, and the president is a role model for many people. So I think that the Cuban people will be given the opportunity or the hope of opportunity.
Well, this is a big deal. The opportunity or the hope of opportunity, right? I mean, we know the situation in terms of human rights in Cuba. I mean, you know, it was removed from the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism last year, and the Obama administration has published a series of rule changes allowing U.S. businesses to export products to Cuban entrepreneurs, and yet nothing has changed for the Cuban people.
Well, that's not entirely true. Since the president issued an executive order in his first term easing restrictions on remittances, a lot more money has flowed into the private sector of Cuba. And the government of Cuba has responded by easing some restrictions on the private sector on 2 occasions. And so today we have a scenario where 11% of the Cuban workforce works in the private sector, and they're no longer dependent on the government of Cuba for their livelihood. Isn't that what we want? Isn't that what many people in Washington have been screaming for so many years?
Right. Well, okay, so let's talk about your story for a moment, Alan, because you were jailed by the Castro government in 2009 for importing banned satellite communications equipment to Cuba as part of a U.S. effort to help Cubans get online. You were freed in December of 2014 as part of a prisoner swap that paved the way for the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Havana and Washington. Can you tell us a bit about your story?
Well, it wasn't a very happy 5 years for me in Cuba.
What was it like?
It was really terrible. It was terrible being separated from my family, and losing freedom is something that is an incredible experience. Not being able to go outside, not having the freedom to do anything. I could only exercise, get my 10,000 steps in by walking around in circles for essentially 5 years. But now I'm a happy camper. I'm home with my family and friends, and I can walk great distances in a straight line. And it's really pretty good.
So what has changed in Cuba? Yeah, what has changed in Cuba from your standpoint then, since when you were jailed?
Well, first of all, internet is now legal for Cubanos. It was legalized in June of 2013. The cost of internet access, even if the service is not really a great service, but the cost of the service went from $6 an hour to $4.50 an hour. Now it's $2 an hour. The government of Cuba has been opening up internet centers around the island and creating Wi-Fi hotspots for those with smartphones to use. And I think that's an incredible development. It doesn't excuse the government for 50 years or 55 years of bad experience, but it shows that they're taking somewhat of a pragmatic approach. And my view is that information is food for the brain. Information and access to it should be a human right, should be considered a human right. And I think the government of Cuba is just starting to realize that without food for the brain, development is thwarted. And their development economically has been tremendously thwarted, not by the embargo, but by their own policies.
So what policies do you want to see changed?
Well, you know, the 11% of the workforce in Cuba is in the private sector now, which means that the government of Cuba is starting to get out of the way so the private sector can flourish. I think that our government needs to do the same thing and lift the embargo.
Let me ask you about what Dr. Manny Alvarez told us earlier. Earlier we spoke with Manny Alvarez. He's best known as Fox News' senior managing health editor, but he's also a Cuban immigrant. Here's what he told us about the president's trip.
the Cuban society, even today, gets monitored constantly. And I would argue even the Cubans' government keeps a tab on all the Cuban Americans that are here. They know what I do or where I'm, the things that I'm saying.
Wow.
So it's still a society that is quite controlled by the government.
Alan, are you still being monitored?
Here?
Yeah, you.
Well, if I'm being monitored, it's by our government, not theirs.
Well, he just said Cubans who are in America are being monitored. That's what Dr. Manny Alvarez said.
No, he said Cuban Americans. He said Cuban Americans. He didn't specify location.
Okay. So you don't think you're being monitored?
Me?
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
I'm not that paranoid.
Okay.
I'm not paranoid. Unlike the government of Cuba, which has certain pathologies, and they're not likely to give up control, per se, for a number of years to come, just as we won't achieve normalization anytime soon. It's going to be a long and arduous path that we have to take. But I think it's very important to note that some very significant changes have taken place on the island, that Cubanos now have better communications. Even though the communications are still rotten, they're better than they were. They're no longer being arrested for trying to log on to the internet like 3 billion other people around the world do.
So it sounds like you think that this trip is worthwhile for the president to go to Cuba, despite the fact that there's a pretty good pushback that the U.S. isn't really getting anything in return in terms of helping to open up markets.
Well, I think that's a misnomer. With the trade that we've done with Cuba just in the past 6 years, by Department of Commerce estimates that says for every $180,000 in U.S. exports, 1 U.S. job is created. That means just from our business with Cuba, 5,556 jobs have been created. If there was no embargo, that would be 6 times. According to an ITC study, we would be doing $6 billion at least in business a year. That's 33,000 jobs in the United States. That's in our best interest.
All right, we will leave it there. Alan, good to have you on the program this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Alan
Thank you very much.